The Pacific Ocean off the western coast of Mexico often appears uniform. Long swells move without interruption, and the surface reflects light in a way that gives few clues about distance or scale. On most days, there is no visible boundary between working waters and open ocean. Fishing boats leave the shore and return without ceremony, following routes that have been used for decades. In November 2012, the sea conditions were seasonally stable. The tropical storm cycle had largely passed. Winds were moderate. The water temperature was warm enough to support surface life, from small fish to drifting debris. This was a region where coastal fishermen operated regularly, traveling far enough to reach productive fishing grounds but close enough to expect a return within days. The fishing vessel involved in this story was small by commercial standards. It was designed for short trips, not prolonged exposure to open water. Its navigation depended on basic instruments, its power on a single diesel engine. Like many boats in the region, it carried limited safety equipment and relied on experience rather than redundancy. At the time of departure, there was nothing unusual about the setting. The horizon was clear. The boat moved steadily westward from the port of San Blas, Nayarit. Other vessels were visible at varying distances, each following its own path across the water. There was no immediate sense of isolation. The ocean, at this stage, functioned as a workplace. It was predictable enough to be trusted and vast enough to be ignored. The events that followed would unfold slowly, shaped less by sudden disaster than by distance, mechanical failure, and time. The two men aboard the boat came from different places but shared a working familiarity with the sea. José Salvador Alvarenga was born in El Salvador and had spent much of his adult life fishing along the Pacific coast of southern Mexico. By 2012, he was living and working in the state of Chiapas, operating as a small-scale fisherman for hire. His experience was practical rather than formal. He had learned through repetition, weather, and observation, spending long days offshore and returning with whatever the water allowed. Alvarenga was in his 30s at the time. He was known locally for his endurance and his willingness to take longer trips than many others. These trips were not uncommon in the region. Fishermen often traveled far offshore to set long lines for sharks or other large fish, staying out for days at a time. The work was physically demanding but economically necessary. Profit depended on distance, timing, and luck. Accompanying him on this trip was Ezequiel Cordoba, a younger man in his early 20s. Cordoba had less experience. Some reports describe him as a novice fisherman who joined the voyage shortly before departure. His role was to assist with baiting hooks, managing lines, and handling basic tasks on deck. There is limited documentation about his background beyond his age and place of origin, which was also in southern Mexico. What is known is that he did not have the same familiarity with extended offshore fishing as Alvarenga. The journey began in mid-November 2012. Most sources place the departure on November 17, though exact dates vary slightly in different accounts. The boat left from a small coastal community near the Mexico-Guatemala border, often identified as Costa Azul, Chiapas. The destination was not a specific port or waypoint but a fishing area known to local crews. The plan was to fish for sharks, using long lines baited with small fish, and to return within a short period. The boat itself was an open fiberglass skiff, approximately 7 meters long. It had no cabin and offered minimal protection from sun or rain. Power came from a single outboard engine. Supplies were limited to what was needed for a few days: ice for preserving fish, fuel for the engine, basic food, and water. There was no satellite phone. Navigation depended on a GPS unit and visual reference. Safety equipment, such as life jackets or emergency beacons, was minimal or absent, consistent with common practice among small fishing operations in the area. The decision to leave was routine. Weather forecasts did not indicate severe conditions. Alvarenga had made similar trips before, sometimes pushing farther offshore than planned. The risks were understood in general terms but accepted as part of the work. There is no evidence of urgency or distress at the time of departure. Once the boat cleared the coastal waters, it entered a zone where communication became unreliable. Cellular signals faded. Other vessels became less frequent. The two men focused on their task, setting lines and managing bait. At this stage, the journey followed a familiar pattern. The sea remained calm enough to work. The engine functioned normally. The isolation was physical but not yet consequential. What neither man could account for was how dependent their situation was on a single mechanical system and how quickly routine could become irreversible once that system failed. The change in circumstances did not occur abruptly. There was no collision, no visible damage to the hull, and no immediate threat from weather. The failure began with the engine. Accounts differ on the exact sequence, but it is consistently reported that the outboard motor stopped functioning after the boat had traveled far offshore. Some sources indicate that the engine was affected by water contamination or mechanical wear. Others suggest that fuel issues may have played a role. What is clear is that the engine could not be restarted. Attempts were made to repair it using the limited tools on board, but the effort was unsuccessful. The boat was no longer under power. At this distance from shore, drifting was not immediately alarming. The Pacific currents in this region move steadily westward, and fishermen are aware that a disabled vessel will travel slowly but continuously. The assumption at first was that the boat would remain within reach of common fishing routes. Alvarenga expected that another vessel would pass within visual range. The men attempted to signal passing boats. They used what they had, waving arms, reflective surfaces, and improvised markers. No response came. The ocean traffic in that area was sparse, and the boat's low profile made it difficult to see from a distance. As hours became days, the implications of the failure became clearer. Fuel was no longer relevant, but water and food were. The ice used to preserve fish melted quickly. The remaining supplies were not intended for an extended drift. The GPS unit eventually lost power. With no propulsion and no reliable navigation, the boat's position became uncertain. Wind and current dictated movement. The vessel drifted west and south, away from the coast and into the open Pacific. The horizon remained unchanged. There were no landmarks, no signs of proximity to land. This was the point at which the situation crossed from inconvenience to isolation. The men were no longer delayed. They were separated from established routes and from any predictable path back to shore. The engine failure was final, not because it was dramatic, but because it removed the only means of control they had over their position. From this moment forward, survival depended not on travel, but on endurance. Once the boat was fully under the control of wind and current, daily life narrowed to a set of basic requirements. The men had to secure water, find food, and protect themselves from exposure. There was no broader plan. Survival became incremental, structured around hours rather than destinations. Rain provided the first opportunity for water. When storms passed over the boat, Alvarenga and Cordoba used containers and improvised surfaces to collect rainfall. Plastic jugs, a cooler lid, and sections of the boat itself were used to channel water into storage. This method was unreliable. Rain did not fall consistently, and when it did, much of it was lost to evaporation or contamination with salt spray. Water was rationed carefully. Dehydration remained a constant concern. Food came from the sea. The fishing lines originally intended for sharks were repurposed. When hooks were lost, new ones were fashioned from metal fragments and other available materials. Fish were caught intermittently, sometimes in sufficient quantity, sometimes not at all. Small fish were eaten raw. Larger catches were divided and consumed over several days when possible. Without salt or fire, preservation was limited. Spoilage occurred quickly. Birds became another source of food. When seabirds landed on the boat or flew close enough, they were caught by hand. Their meat was eaten, and their blood provided additional fluid intake. Bones were discarded overboard. This practice was documented later in Alvarenga's account and is consistent with survival behavior observed in other long-term maritime drift incidents. Shelter was minimal. The open skiff offered no shade beyond what could be improvised using clothing and plastic. Sun exposure was severe. During the day, the men attempted to limit movement to conserve energy and reduce fluid loss. At night, temperatures dropped, and the absence of dry clothing increased discomfort. Sleep occurred in short intervals, disrupted by weather and the movement of the boat. Routine developed out of necessity. Lines were checked at regular intervals. Rain collection was prepared whenever clouds appeared. The boat was inspected for damage. There was little else to do. Time passed without clear markers. Days were counted informally, though accuracy became uncertain as weeks turned into months. Psychological strain increased gradually. The lack of external reference points made it difficult to assess progress or proximity to land. The horizon remained constant. No shipping lanes were crossed. Aircraft were rarely seen. Each missed opportunity for rescue reinforced the isolation. Health issues emerged. Sunburn was persistent. Salt sores developed where skin remained wet. Minor injuries healed slowly. Cordoba, who had less experience with prolonged exposure, began to show signs of physical decline earlier. He struggled with dehydration and had difficulty maintaining intake when food was scarce. Despite these conditions, the boat remained afloat. The hull did not fail. Supplies were minimal but functional. The sea continued to provide intermittent sustenance. There were no dramatic turning points during this period. Survival was sustained through repetition and adaptation rather than ingenuity or luck. The drift continued across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. Neither man knew the distance traveled. Currents carried them steadily westward, away from the Americas and toward the Central Pacific. This movement was invisible but constant. By the time several months had passed, survival was no longer about planning for rescue. It was about maintaining the routines that allowed the next day to occur. As the months progressed, the balance that had allowed survival began to weaken. The routines remained, but their effectiveness declined. Rainfall became less frequent. Fish were harder to catch. The physical cost of constant exposure accumulated in ways that could not be reversed with rest. Ezequiel Cordoba's condition deteriorated first. Historical accounts indicate that he increasingly refused food, particularly raw fish and birds. Whether this was due to illness, psychological stress, or both is not fully documented. What is known is that his intake dropped significantly. Dehydration followed. Without sufficient water, the body's ability to process food diminished further. Alvarenga continued to fish and collect rainwater when possible, but the distribution of resources became uneven by necessity. Cordoba grew weaker. He spent more time lying still, exposed to the elements. His ability to assist with daily tasks declined until he was largely unable to participate at all. The passing of time became indistinct. Without a functioning calendar or reliable way to track days, duration was measured only in physical change. Weight loss was severe. Muscle mass diminished. Skin damage worsened. The men's appearance altered in ways consistent with prolonged malnutrition and sun exposure. Sometime after several months adrift, Cordoba died on the boat. Precise timing varies across reports, but most place his death within the first 4 months of the drift. There is no evidence of violence or sudden injury. His death appears to have resulted from dehydration, malnutrition, and general physical collapse. Alvarenga was alone after this point. The body remained on the boat for a period of time. Alvarenga later stated that he did not immediately dispose of it, though details about the duration are inconsistent. Eventually, the body was placed into the ocean. This act was not accompanied by ceremony or recorded reflection. It was a practical decision under constrained conditions. After Cordoba's death, survival continued in a more solitary form. The same methods were used to obtain food and water. There was no change in the environment. The ocean remained constant. The absence of another person altered the dynamic of the boat but did not introduce new external threats. Isolation became complete. There was no one to share tasks or observations. The routines continued because there was no alternative. Alvarenga later reported that he spoke aloud at times, though this cannot be independently verified. What can be confirmed is that he remained physically capable of fishing, collecting rainwater, and maintaining the boat. The drift continued westward. Oceanographers later estimated that the boat traveled more than 10,000 kilometers over the course of the ordeal, driven by prevailing currents. This movement was gradual and unnoticed by the person aboard. There were no signs indicating proximity to land until the final weeks. By this stage, survival was no longer measured in hope of rescue. It was measured in continuity. Each day that ended without loss of function made the next day possible. The absence of immediate danger did not reduce the cumulative strain. The situation remained unchanged, but the margin for survival narrowed steadily. On January 30, 2014, the boat reached land. After approximately 438 days adrift, it came ashore on Eben Atoll in the Marshall Islands, a remote coral atoll in the Central Pacific Ocean. The arrival was not controlled. The vessel was carried by surf and shallow currents until it grounded near the shoreline. The landmass was small and sparsely populated. Eben Atoll lies far from major shipping routes and commercial ports. Its isolation is one of the reasons the boat had not been intercepted earlier. The distance from the point of departure in Mexico to this location is estimated at over 10,500 kilometers. Alvarenga was discovered by local residents. His physical condition reflected long-term exposure and malnutrition. He was emaciated, with visible weight loss and skin damage consistent with prolonged sun exposure. Despite this, he was able to walk with assistance. There was no immediate medical emergency requiring evacuation, though he was provided with food, water, and shelter. Local authorities were notified, and the circumstances of his arrival were documented. Over the following days, Alvarenga's account was recorded and compared with known ocean current patterns. Independent analysis by oceanographers confirmed that the drift path he described was consistent with prevailing Pacific currents. The boat itself showed signs of extended exposure but remained structurally intact. There were no modifications beyond improvised fishing lines and makeshift rain collection surfaces. No navigational equipment was functioning. There was no public celebration. The event was treated as an unusual but verifiable maritime survival case. Alvarenga was later transferred for medical evaluation and eventually repatriated. The ordeal ended without ceremony, not because it lacked significance, but because its conclusion was defined by arrival rather than rescue. The story of 438 days adrift is recorded in a quiet ledger of human endurance. It is not a tale of heroism in the traditional sense. It is a record of the sea's scale, of mechanical failure, and of the human body's ability to persist under sustained deprivation. Alvarenga's drift confirms the predictable influence of Pacific currents, the fragility of small vessels, and the incremental toll of isolation. It illustrates how distance and time reshape survival, reducing the problem to basic needs, water, food, and the ability to endure exposure. The incident is referenced in studies of maritime survival and oceanic drift, demonstrating that small craft can travel extreme distances when uncontrolled, and that a single human's resilience can bridge vast expanses, though not without cost. Cordoba's death, recorded quietly, is part of that reality. Survival was selective, determined by endurance rather than circumstance alone. In the quiet that follows, the ocean remains unchanged. Currents continue their course. Small boats drift without attention. The incident leaves no noise, no dramatization, only the measure of distance, the passage of time, and the persistence of a human life against the slow, relentless scale of the sea.